Thank you for joining us to another Central Elevation webinar. I am your host, Nando Mogollon, and today we'll be continuing our webinar series where we're getting in touch with the quality model checking phase. So today we're going to talk about checking the model, but for a specific purpose. So last time we did run through the process of auditing a model for the purposes of checking simple modeling errors and construction errors that may be reflected in those models. But today we're going to focus beyond that into whatever exchange information requirements for the project information model will be requested from the project. So I'm going to touch base on the following points. For project information requirements or exchange information requirements, we're going to focus on three groups. One of them will be the simple geometry, that is, what is it that the model has that is on your scope or not under your scope. Therefore, your model should be required to have certain elements. The level of detail and granularity, which is something that we have touched on previous webinars. On information, this is the part that we're going to focus more heavily in the next 25 minutes. We're going to check the identification data, required properties, and whatever linked information we have. Now, linked information I don't have at the moment, but we can touch base on a future webinar as well. I'm going to focus heavily again on required properties and identification data. And then relationships, which is any added systems, groups, or types, or materials, and other information that is not exactly the individual element types, but rather the composition and grouping and assemblies of the models and how do they relate to each other. So those are essential things that need to be checked within a project information model that it's part of the exchange information requirements for a project. Not included in this webinar, but then we're going to see that on a future webinar. We also want to check eventually for functional aspects of the project, constructability, and other items that might be code related. We're not going to check on that today, but we're going to cover those topics on a future webinar. Then, as we always do, we're going to run an exercise where I'm going to show you how to double check these requirements, particularly geometry, information, and relationships inside ArchiCAD prior to the export of the IFC file. And then we're going to do the same, but we'll do it with Solibri Office for the process of checking that once you have the IFC after the export. So we're going to go ahead and check those couple of things. Before we start, let's add a few notes and a few comments. First will be that as per today, and this is something that can change anytime since this is evolving as we speak, the current international standard, the ISO 19650, the part that will explicitly talk about information exchange is still under development. So most of the information we have and most of the rules we follow in here actually rely on a previous version of the standard that serves as a basis for the ISO, which is the British 1192 or publicly available standard 1192. Within that, there's a portion of that, I believe is chapter 5, that actually explicitly mentions information exchange information requirements as employer information requirements. That consists of a lot of information that is not only related to the model, but within that, it actually relates to a model development table that contains LOD among other things. And we're going to give you an example of that. Most of the other items are just as important, but they're not part of the actual model itself or the things you need to check on the model for the purpose of auditing. So within that context, just to make sure that we all agree on the concepts, what we're talking about when we mention information requirements and then exchange information requirements, what we're saying is that within the project, you're going to have multiple number of people, multiple disciplines producing individual models that eventually will be federated. In order for that information to be exchanged in a way that serves everyone else's purpose, therefore it helps progressing the coordination of the project and the evolution of the project within its timeline, then everyone that's involved will have certain requirements from other people. Structural engineers will require the architects to provide them with an idea of which elements are meant to be load-bearing and which ones are not. An acoustic consultant should be able to provide the architect with information about which, say, walls or ceilings or finishes or openings, doors and windows and glazing, which of those will require any particular acoustic transmittal ratings and so on. Same thing applies for fire, etc., etc. The builder may require specific information about the materials and so on and on and on. So everyone will have certain requirements, and when those requirements are put together, that's where you build up and exchange information requirement that serves everyone's purpose. That also comes with, or it comes informed by the owner's project information requirements. So they'll have certain requirements for the project. Those will also be feeding the exchange information requirements because they'll be needed later on or strategically for whatever project purposes. Usually, these exchange information requirements will form part of the BIM execution plan. So the BIM execution plan, in one of the chapters or one of its parts, should have these exchange requirements explicitly described within them. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. So the first thing I would like to show you here will be an example of a table that you may include within those exchange information requirements, probably as part or as an addendum for the BIM execution plan. Okay, so what we have here is a typical MPDT or a model development table that we have taken from the New South Wales Transport Department, which is publicly available, and it's essentially a spreadsheet that you can download. Now, what we have here is a fairly simplified version, and the only thing we have changed in here, if anything, is we just have added just a few elements as an example of what the exchange and the information requirements will be for typical elements. So right now we're assuming we're dealing with the architectural file, since this is the file we've been playing with. We're going to say, hey, we'll need walls, partitions, and a bunch of other elements, doors, and so on, and they all will need certain requirements. And level of detail required is going to be 200, but that's only at design development. Later on, that can change, and so on. And they may require, let's say, a uniclass classification system. This could be anything else. Every country will use different ones. In Australia, we also use NatSpec. In New Zealand, it's also used MasterSpec, if I'm not confused. And then all these elements will have specific requirements. One of the things that I've done already is to add, and this is very common, it's to add those property requirements within the same table. So what we have here is, if I've got walls, either load or non-load bearing, I have certain requirements that are actually in a different tab in the same spreadsheet. So all I need to do is click on that, and that should take me to that page here. If you have used it already, you'll notice that this is the same page we take from the NatSpec properties generator. So if you haven't seen that, go double check one of the previous webinars we have produced where we showed you how to pull out individual element requirements depending on what do you need. So when you download that from the NatSpec website, essentially what you get is something like this. And all you need to do is to add one per element, which is not that complicated altogether since you don't have to type anything. All you need to do is to bring it into this spreadsheet. So the couple of things I want to focus on here are the following. This will be for partitions, wall, load-bearing, and not load-bearing. So I've brought that in here. And one of the things that I can notice already is that I will have certain properties that will be required, and they all follow within the typical property set for wall common elements. These are within the IFC 2x3 model view definition for coordination or coordination view 2.0. So we need to make sure that if we receive this document, essentially what they're asking us is to produce those walls, both load and non-load bearing, but also the partitions, with these very specific properties, and they need to be compliant to that. So we want to check that we're producing a model that contains these properties, in this case for walls, as well as the basic geometric data. This is what they're requiring here. These are two different types of data, and I want to make sure that you guys know where to locate that within ArchiCAD and then within the IFC. They also require us the classification, so the properties generator also brings in the available classification tables and the individual chapters that you may need to use. So I'm going to follow that as to be the requirement. And just to give you a different flavor of that, this will be same requirements, but for doors. In this case, they're asking for 3 of them: acoustic rating, infiltration values, which is air infiltration around the doors, and the thermal transmittance rating over the doors. Additional to that, they're also asking for geometrical data that is in the shape of all of these bits and pieces. Typically, that's the measurement of sub-elements. Classifications as well as they are described above. So all we have here is just a sample of what normally will be a much more complicated, more complex table, where essentially every one of those bits and pieces will have an individual requirement of this kind. Right, so now we have something to follow. We just need to make sure that we populate our models with that information and that the IFC comes out with all of that already in there. And then we're going to check that if we actually complying with that within ArchiCAD, and then we'll export the IFC and then check that we have complied or that the IFC actually comes out with that data included. So I'm just going to move these away and let's bring ArchiCAD on board. Okay, once again, you have seen this model quite a few times already. And this is the one we've been using for the sake of exchanging our files and demonstrating the transmission of ArchiCAD elements into IFC elements. So the first thing we want to do here is to go and make sure that our translator, the one we're going to use for the sake of the exchange, it's actually mapping up. And again, I'm focusing heavily here on data since we have touched base in some of the other topics, but we want to focus on data today. If you have any questions, by all means, there is a question panel on the GoToWebinar app. So if you have a question, just type it there. We'll happy to try to reply that over email. All right, so first thing you want to do is go over to your translators, which I already have a shortcut right there. So I've got my translators here. I have the one that I've been using for this purpose of the exchange for coordination. And again, the one thing that I want to focus heavily will be the property mapping. So this is where I control which properties will be mapped into the IFC. Click on the definition, and here we are. So let's start with walls in this case. What I've got here, and this is something I have already, is a list of all the properties that are available within the property set wall common. And again, we're specifically looking for 3 of them. It's 4 of them actually, or well, partitions, that's going to be 5. That's 5 in total. So we're looking for wall common, and the specific properties that we want to bring in will be combustible, whether the wall is of a combustible material, the compartmentation status, whether it's part of a compartment for fire purposes and smoke purposes, if it does extend to the structure, whether it's external or not, whether it's a load-bearing wall or not. So these are the 5 properties that we want to make sure that they are included. So in order to do that, what I need to do inside ArchiCAD will be to make sure that you go within your translator and then the IFC property mapping and look for those. So I have those in here. Combustible, it's right there. And the one thing that you need to make sure is that this is actually linked to some property inside ArchiCAD. Now, that property can come either from an element property itself or a parameter, or from an ArchiCAD property. Some of these may be required to map to a different or a custom created ArchiCAD property, and some others may be already linked to ArchiCAD's own ID attributes, parameters, and so on. So I'll give you a couple of examples of those. Combustible, it's one that I have already created in here. And if you check this, this is essentially let me type it in here. Combustible is an ArchiCAD property within general ratings, and they apply to all doors. So I map that in simply by linking this ArchiCAD property right there through that rule into the IFC combustible property. Compartmentation is the other one that I have on my list. It is exactly the same. I've mapped that into an ArchiCAD property in exactly the same way. Extend to structure, it's of a similar nature. And then we go into 2 that are not quite the same. External, whether the wall is external or not, and the load-bearing status, you will see that they're not mapped in here. And the reason for that is because these 2 are actual attributes inside ArchiCAD. So it's a little bit of, it might be confusing if you have not done this before, but essentially for these 2, you don't need to map that manually. The reason why is because whether the wall is external, whether the wall is load-bearing or not, is part of the essential ArchiCAD attributes. And I'll show you that in a minute. So given this, what I can see from here is that anything that has a link like so, including the acoustic rating and the thermal transmission measure, will also be mapped into the IFC. Generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, you normally don't want to throw in stuff that you have not been required to provide. So, in a normal project, if I've only been required to produce these 5 particular properties, I will likely just get rid of these data here and make sure that we don't overpopulate the model with information that may not have been required. And we can map that later on if in need. So if you needed to do that, thermal transmittance will be something that I'll just take that, delete that rule, and delete that rule. And this particular parameter now won't be part of the IFC because it is not mapped. Okay, so that will be with the walls, and that will apply to all the walls, including partitions and load-bearing and non-load-bearing. When it comes to the doors themselves, similar principle will apply. So for doors, I've got these 3 specific requirements. Oh, by the way, I'm going to talk about this geometric data just in a second. So as property sets, we have acoustic rating, infiltration, and thermal transmittance. You can see that I can find those in here. Acoustic rating, infiltration, and thermal transmittance. I also have a bunch of other elements in here, like whether the doors are external or internal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can double check those and map those whenever necessary. Again, we're focusing on the ones that are strictly required by the BIM execution plan through the project information requirements and exchange information requirements. Similar to that, I've got the acoustic rating, which is already being mapped to different things, including not only architect properties, but actual other object properties that may require to be mapped to. Infiltration is a similar thing, although infiltration is only an ArchiCAD property, and the thermal transmittance can be part of the library part or an additional ArchiCAD property. When you have several rules in this list, ArchiCAD will try to grab whatever value it can take from the top to the bottom. So the first value that populates the property, that's the value that will be used. So make sure that you have the appropriate, a correct sequence in where to look for the value right there. Okay, so that's what you have when it comes to properties. And if we have that mapped, the next thing that needs to happen in order to make sure that that is data that comes out lives in the next setting under data conversion of your translator for export. And that data conversion will explicitly right here say that only these properties that have been mapped will be included. And essentially that's what I just did. I've been including those specific properties that have been requested to include. Now, when it comes to these additional data, these so-called geometric data, these ones in here, that is included inside ArchiCAD when you simply click these door and window parameters in the case of the doors. In the case of walls, they will be included whenever we include simply by jumping in the IFC 2x3, since it's basic IFC data. I'm going to click on OK and click on OK. Now, there are several ways, now that we have made sure that we've got the data included in the translator, you may want to double check simply on the fly that the information is already there. In order to do that, you need to use the IFC project manager. The IFC project manager will simply give you a live view of the IFC file with the data that is being mapped using that particular translator. So what I have in here is, for instance, all these partition walls. And if you activate these two buttons here in the top right, what you get in there is actually the values and properties that have been already populated within the file. Note the following. In the case of walls, the properties combustible, compartmentation, and extent to structure are actually available for you to change from here. So you can actually override them in here, although the information is coming already from ArchiCAD. But the properties is external and load-bearing, since they are core ArchiCAD attributes, they cannot be overridden from here, and they are taken from the file itself. I'm also including the classification for Uniclass, which is something I've been asked to provide. And similarly, doors will do the same. I've got infiltration, thermal transmittance, whether doors are combustible or not. I believe that was the other parameter. Acoustic rating, infiltration, and thermal transmittal. Acoustic rating is probably the one that I've got in there. I've got embedded a few intentional mistakes just to make sure that we show you which elements will comply and which will not. So you can check things with the IFC project manager one by one, like so. But honestly, this is not a real good way to audit the file, because then you're going to have to go over every single element and just try to visually check whether the information is there or not. So there are two better ways of doing that. And as you know, you probably have seen this already, One that I use heavily is simply the creation of schedules. So for instance, I have a schedule here that checks the required properties for walls and partitions. So if I double click on that, essentially this is already building up a schedule that essentially checks the walls by level. And let me show you the ones that I have already organized in here. And then I can see that I've got the under ground floor, I have a bunch of partition walls in there, which are reading from the combustible, compartmentation, extent to structure, the position, whether it's external or internal, and the structural function. It's reading through that, so it's giving me the data that I needed. Whatever I need to change that, I can change it from here directly without having to go directly to the model. So that's a very good way to check for that. And same thing for doors and windows, essentially classifying them with the Uniclass classification system, or not classifying them just to show you how they come up as an error, and then listing the data that have been requested to include. So whether you include the data here or not, that's essentially part of filling up those requirements. So you exchange when you exchange the model, it comes up with the required parameters. Okay, so if there is another way to visually check globally what is happening with the file, that will be essentially the checking of the entire file with graphic overrides. Now, I'll show you a quick sample of that the last time, but let's do it again. Let's say, and I already have built in some of that, you want to check the walls for the combustible property, right? So all I need to do is to switch to that filter. I'll show you what the settings are in a moment, and then set this to not to show me the contours so that I can clear up the visualization in here. What you get in here is in green all the walls that are not combustible, and then in that semi-transparent orange I've got all the walls that are combustible. So I can see that looks like all these partitions seems to be combustible except for that one there in the middle. That might be a mistake, but at least you get a cool a general visualization that gives you an idea of whether this is right or wrong. The way you do that is simply by adding those individual rules, and then these individual rules are essentially looking for the same parameter that you decided to map back into the IFC. And it's a simple matter of going, look, if the parameter is true, give it a color. If it's false, give it another color. Essentially what I'm doing here. If it's false, then it's going to be orange. False, it's going to be green, actually, just the non-combustible. And I can do the same thing with compartmentation, fire rating, etc., etc. Compartmentation is very similar. These are the walls that are meant to be part of a compartment, or walls that are load-bearing, not load-bearing, or don't have a classification for the load-bearing settings. So all of that can be added to your quality checking graphic overrides, and they can visually give you an idea of what's the current status of the file when it comes to property requirements. Now, I've already I exported this IFC, so we can see that as you double check this back in Solibri. So I'm going to jump ahead and open Solibri. Okay, so we're now in Solibri here. It is the same file, just in IFC format, and the export that I did just a minute ago. And within here, there are a couple of things you can do. First is, if you have Solibri Office, you can run a series of checks within Solibri. I've already built mine in here, essentially built on those groups of requirements that we started to talk about, the geometry, the data and information, and then the relationships. Again, I've focused essentially on the geometry with those two examples, walls and doors, but I also did check required components. So essentially within the required components, I said, look, you need to give me a wall, you need to give me a model that comes with a series of elements. Now I've got walls, slabs, roofs, columns, and so on, which is something I can manipulate. assuming that that was the requirement. And I know this model doesn't contain a lot of that, doesn't contain windows, for instance. So when I check this rule, it essentially will tell me, look, you have no beams, no stairs, no spaces, and no windows within that, which is fine, since this is exactly the kind of model that I've been putting together, and I was expecting that to happen. When it comes to the information, though, then I can use a particular rule inside Solibri that actually goes and checks for those specific parameters. So checking for the exchange information requirements for the project information model, it's a matter of selecting which element type you're checking for against, checking essentially for these ones here, and say, look for those walls within the property set wall common. I need the property combustible, compartmentation, extended structure, and whether it's load bearing or not. So given these parameters, so we'll go and find those items. Similarly, I've done it for the property sets within doors. So checking infiltration and thermal transmittance. If I need to add anything, say I need to add within door common, thermal transmittance is already there. Let's say you want to get one of the double checking, the geometry, that geometry data. Let's say we want to have this lining thickness, or let's say we have the casing or the panel width, for instance. You just need to make sure that the panel width exists with any value. Doesn't have to be any particular value, but let's say any value at all. Then you can go ahead and check the model. This will come up with some results. Missing properties is telling me, look, door components don't have the panel width parameter because I didn't include that. I just made that up right here. But then it will also give me other values in here, like for instance, these doors do not have the infiltration parameter. Although they have the parameter, they may not have a value for it. So for instance, infiltration comes to 0 rather than an actual value that should be accepted. So with this, you can actually go ahead and check, see which elements do not have some of the properties. Because in this case, this is telling me, look, couldn't find load-bearing settings for those, which is similar to what we had in Archicad when I was checking the load-bearing status in here. So if you see that, these red walls, those red elements in there, have no status for load-bearing, which I knew about this when I was prior to export the file. So this one is essentially telling me the same thing, but on the IFC side. So you can check things before and after that. The things that make Solibri a really powerful tool for this kind of auditing is that you can go beyond that essentially and start double checking these based on schedules. So these schedules in here can allow me to double check the status of, super quickly, the status of the information requirements for doors. For instance, this one is a list that is giving me, the infiltration property, the thermal transmittal property, and whether it's external or internal for the door, and essentially telling me the story all at once, saying, look, these yellow doors have essentially no values for most of them, and at least the blue ones, I know that they're internal. Their property is external is false, but have no values for thermal transmitters and common infiltration, so I can come back and populate those values if we need. Same thing for the walls. I can build rather quickly and a graphical feedback coloring the model right away, and information when I can tell which properties these will have been populated and what's the value of those, and it will color code them. For instance, worst case scenario, I can tell these yellow walls have don't have the load-bearing property populated, and they're supposed to be not part of a compartmentation, they're not extended to the structure, whether they're load bearing or not. Apparently, according to this, only this green one is the only one that is being load bearing. So this will help you rather quickly to evaluate what the status of the model when it comes to properties themselves. And out of this, then you can create a report, send back information back to Archicad without a problem, or to whatever discipline or whatever author of the model is, just by checking via rule sets, the way I did it in here, or simply by creating schedules that will populate the 3D window with a color-coded setting. And then you can quickly check the values of those elements based on those properties. Okay, so that's, we run out of time already. So I hope you enjoyed the webinar and it was informative for the purpose of auditing models when you need to comply to certain project information model requirements and exchange information requirements. We still have a few things in there that we want to keep covering in future webinars, so don't miss those. With that QR code there on the screen or the website as it is described there, will take you to the online calendar where we have all the following webinars. Please subscribe to those and don't miss any other webinars, although they're essentially every Tuesday. For those of you in Australia and New Zealand, remember you have support over the support hotline at that number there on the screen. Otherwise, just go to myci@centralelevation.com or use the support emails. Don't forget to register and check all the additional content we have under myci@centralelevation.com. And stay tuned for next week, where we're going to keep moving on the phase of model checking and checking for quality. And we're going to go ahead and start doing functional checks, code-related checks, and so on. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.